He thought he was about to teach her a lesson, but he had no idea he was about to expose his own arrogance in front of everyone who once respected him. The gym smelled faintly of rubber mats and polished wood, the low hum of conversation bouncing off the mirrored walls as students stretched and wrapped their hands, waiting for the evening class to begin. Brad Hoffman stood at the center, his black belt tied perfectly, posture confident, voice carrying the authority of someone used to being admired. People listened when he spoke, and more importantly, they believed him. Then the door opened quietly. Emily Carter stepped in without making a scene, dressed in a simple gray hoodie, worn sneakers, and black leggings that looked like they had seen better days. No designer logos, no flashy gear, nothing that signaled experience or status. Just quiet presence. A few heads turned, not out of respect, but curiosity. She walked toward the sign-in desk with calm, measured steps, her gaze steady but soft, like someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything. Brad noticed her almost immediately, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a single dismissive glance. To him, she was predictable. Another beginner. Another person looking to try something new. Another easy example. "You new here?" he called out, his tone casual but edged with amusement. Emily nodded once. "Yeah, just wanted to join a class." A few students exchanged glances, subtle smirks forming. Brad chuckled lightly, stepping closer, circling her just enough to let others feel the shift in attention. "You ever trained before?" he asked, tilting his head, already assuming the answer. Emily paused for a fraction of a second, then replied a little. The answer was honest, but it didn't land the way it should have. Brad laughed, louder this time, inviting the room to join him. "A little, huh?" he repeated, looking around as if sharing a joke. "Well, we like to welcome beginners properly here." The energy in the room shifted, curiosity turning into anticipation. This wasn't unusual. Brad had a habit of putting new people on the spot, framing it as encouragement, but everyone knew it was something else. A subtle display, a reminder of who was in control. Emily stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed the faint scars along her knuckles, the way her shoulders settled. Not tense, not nervous, just ready. Brad gestured toward the mat. "Why don't you step up for a quick demonstration?" he said, his voice smooth, confident, almost friendly. "Nothing serious. Just so everyone can see where you're at." A few students chuckled under their breath. One whispered, "This should be interesting." Another pulled out his phone, not to record, but out of habit, sensing something worth remembering. Emily didn't respond immediately. She looked at the mat, then back at Brad, her eyes calm, unreadable. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, though no one knew why. "You sure?" Brad added, leaning in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound like concern, but loud enough for others to hear. "I don't want you getting overwhelmed your first day." More laughter, light but sharp. Emily exhaled slowly, then reached up and pulled her hair back, tying it with a simple band from her wrist. The movement was unhurried, almost deliberate, as if time had slowed down around her. The chatter in the room softened, not because anyone asked it to, but because something about her composure didn't match the narrative they had already written for her. Brad stepped back, giving her space, a confident smile still on his face. In his mind, this was already over. But as Emily stepped onto the mat, placing her feet with quiet precision, something invisible shifted in the air. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to make a few people straighten their posture without knowing why. And somewhere in the back of the room, a voice barely above a whisper said, "Wait, why does she look so familiar?" Brad took a slow step back, giving Emily space as the faint squeak of sneakers against the mat echoed through the room, a sound that suddenly felt louder than it should have. The students shifted, forming a loose circle, their earlier laughter fading into a quieter kind of curiosity. Some crossed their arms, others leaned in slightly, sensing something had changed even if they could not explain it. Brad rolled his shoulders casually, still wearing that confident half smile, the kind built from years of being the best in the room. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once as if to reset the atmosphere. Let us keep this simple. His voice carried, easily practiced and controlled. Just a basic movement check. Nothing complicated. Emily nodded once, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her eyes not on Brad's face, but on the space around him, as if she was measuring more than just the moment. That detail went unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. In the far corner, one older student frowned slightly, watching her stance with growing confusion. It was subtle, but it was not beginner behavior. Brad stepped forward, demonstrating a light movement, almost exaggerated, clearly expecting her to mirror him awkwardly. Follow my lead, he said, tone light, but edged with something sharper underneath. Emily moved. Smooth, controlled, not perfect in a showy way, but efficient, like someone who had repeated the motion more times than could be counted. The difference was small, but it landed. A few people straightened. Brad's smile flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before returning. Not bad, he said quickly, brushing it off, turning slightly to address the group. You see, even beginners can. He stopped mid-sentence. Emily had already adjusted her stance again, unprompted, correcting a detail he had not even mentioned yet. It was precise. Too precise. The air shifted again. No one laughed this time. Brad cleared his throat, stepping closer, now more focused, his tone tightening just slightly. Let us try something else. He gestured again, this time faster, expecting hesitation. Emily followed without hesitation. No motion, no confusión, just quiet execution. The room grew still, the earlier energy dissolving into something heavier, something uncertain. A young student near the front whispered, "How is she doing that?" But no one answered. Brad exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath, but the confidence in his posture began to shift into something else, something closer to concentration. All right, he said, this time more serious, dropping the casual tone. Let us add a little pressure. He moved in slightly, not aggressively, but enough to test her response. The kind of move he had done thousands of times, expecting the same result every time. Different now. Not instructor and beginner. Something else. Something balanced. Brad straightened, forcing a light chuckle, glancing around as if to regain control of the moment. Looks like you have been practicing more than a little, he said, but the joke did not land the way he expected. No one laughed. Emily's expression remained calm, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. Just enough, she said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not match her appearance. In the back, the same voice from earlier whispered again, louder this time, "I swear I have seen her before." Another student leaned in, eyes narrowing, trying to place it. Meanwhile, Brad took another step forward, slower now, more deliberate, his movements no longer performative but testing. For the first time since she walked in, he was no longer trying to impress the room. He was trying to understand her. And that was when the balance shifted completely, though only a few could feel it. Emily stood there, quiet, composed, not challenging, not retreating, simply present. The kind of presence that did not ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. The gym, once filled with noise and casual arrogance, now felt different. Still, focused, waiting, and somewhere between the sound of steady breathing and the faint hum of overhead lights, the truth was beginning to surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. He had not invited her onto the mat to test her. He had just revealed himself instead. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the gym like something invisible but undeniable, pressing against every person in that room as Brad stood facing Emily, no longer relaxed, no longer amused, but calculating, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to solve a problem that refused to fit into his expectations. Joke, but as a line drawn. A few students exchanged glances, sensing the shift in tone, the subtle tension tightening in the air. Emily did not react immediately. She simply adjusted her footing, a small, almost unnoticeable movement, her weight settling evenly, her posture aligned in a way that spoke of experience without needing to announce it. Her eyes remained steady, not aggressive, Not defensive, just aware. Brad stepped forward again, initiating a controlled movement, something simple on the surface, but layered with intention, the kind of motion designed to reveal inexperience. It was the kind of test he had used countless times, always with the same result. But not this time. Emily responded instantly, not with force, not with resistance, but with precision, redirecting the motion effortlessly, her timing exact, her control unmistakable. It was clean. Too clean. Brad paused again, this time longer, his breath catching for just a second before he masked it. But the pause was enough. Enough for the room to feel it. Enough for the quiet to become heavier. Someone in the back shifted their stance. No longer relaxed, their attention fully locked in. Another lowered their phone slowly, no longer interested in casual distraction, now completely focused. Brad straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, the confidence that once filled the space around him now pulling inward, turning into concentration, into something closer to caution. "Where did you train?" he asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could filter it, his voice sharper than intended. Emily looked at him, her expression unchanged, calm, almost neutral, as if the question did not carry the weight he thought it did. "Here and there," she replied softly. The answer was vague, but it was not uncertain. It was controlled, and that made it more unsettling. Brad exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to relax, glancing briefly around the room, aware now that the attention was no longer just on her. It was on him as well. The dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not yet explain it. He stepped in again, this time with more intent, his movement sharper, faster, but still measured, still within control. Emily did not step back. She did not rush. She simply moved, matching his pace without effort, her reactions not delayed, not guessed, but anticipated, as if she already knew what was coming before it happened. The difference was subtle, but it was undeniable. It was not reaction. It was understanding. The mirror along the wall reflected the moment from a different angle, and for the first time, it did not look like an instructor guiding a beginner. It looked balanced, equal, and that realization spread quietly through the room like a ripple. A student near the edge leaned closer to another and whispered, "He is not leading anymore." The words were quiet, but they carried. Brad heard them, even if he pretended not to, and something in his expression tightened further. He stopped moving for a brief second, just long enough to reset, his eyes locking onto Emily with a new intensity. This was no longer about demonstration. This was about control, and he was starting to lose it. Emily remained still, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, as if none of this unsettled her at all. She was not trying to win. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply there, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. The room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held something else entirely. Recognition was beginning to form, not fully clear yet, but growing stronger with each passing second. In the back, the same voice spoke again, louder now, almost certain, "No, it cannot be. She moves exactly like." The sentence trailed off unfinished, but the meaning lingered in the air. And in that suspended moment, as Brad prepared to step forward again, one thing had already become clear to everyone watching, even if they had not said it out loud yet. This was never going to go the way he planned. The moment did not explode, it tightened like a wire pulled too far, too fast, and everyone in the room could feel it even if they did not understand it, because something invisible had shifted completely, and there was no going back to what this had been just minutes ago. Brad stepped forward again, but this time there was no casual rhythm, no demonstration energy, no trace of the instructor who had walked into the center of the mat with complete control. This step carried weight. His shoulders were squared, his movements more careful, more calculated, as if he was now trying to confirm something he did not want to believe. Emily did not mirror him immediately. She stood still for a fraction of a second longer than before, her eyes steady, her posture composed, her breathing unchanged, and in that stillness there was something powerful, something that made the entire room feel like it had slowed down. Then she moved, not fast, not dramatic, just enough, A small shift of position, a quiet adjustment that aligned her body perfectly with his approach, and suddenly the space between them felt different, like it had been measured and understood long before this moment. Brad initiated again, this time with sharper intent, testing boundaries, applying pressure, expecting to finally see hesitation, expecting to find the crack that would restore his certainty. But it never came. Emily responded with the same calm precision, guiding the moment instead of reacting to it, her movements efficient, controlled, and completely unforced. It was not resistance. It was redirection, and that difference was everything. The students watching could feel it now, the unmistakable realization creeping into their thoughts, replacing curiosity with something heavier, something closer to disbelief. No one spoke. No one laughed. The earlier noise of the gym had vanished completely, replaced by a silence that felt almost deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting for something to be revealed. Brad stepped back suddenly, creating space, his chest rising slightly as he took a controlled breath, but the change was visible now. The confidence he had carried so effortlessly was no longer outward. It had turned inward, into focus, into caution. He looked at Emily again, this time not as a beginner, not as a participant, but as something unknown. "You have done this before," he said, his voice lower, no longer asking, but stating, as if trying to anchor himself to something certain. Emily's gaze did not waver. "Yes," she answered simply. The word was quiet, but it carried clarity. No explanation, no elaboration, just truth. And that truth landed heavier than anything else that had happened so far. In the back of the room, the whisper returned, no longer uncertain, no longer searching. "It is her," the voice said, just loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Emily Carter. She used to compete, national level." The words spread quickly, not through noise, but through recognition, passing from one person to another like a ripple that could not be stopped. A few students straightened immediately, their expressions shifting from curiosity to realization. One step back, unconsciously creating more space around the mat, as if acknowledging something that demanded distance. Brad heard it this time, clearly, the name, the realization, and for the first time, his expression changed completely. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough. Enough for those watching closely to see the moment his understanding caught up with reality. He looked at her again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her presence, but at her stance, her balance, the small details he had overlooked before. And now they all made sense. The precision, the timing, the control. None of it was accidental. None of it was new. He let out a slow breath, stepping forward once more, but this time there was no performance left at all. No audience. No demonstration. Just two people on a mat, one finally realizing who he was standing in front of. Emily remained exactly as she had been since the beginning, calm, grounded, unaffected by the shift around her. She had not changed. The room had. The perception had. And that was where the real difference lay. Brad lifted his hands slightly, not in challenge, not in dominance, but in acknowledgement, a subtle shift that only a few would understand, but it was enough. Enough to show that something had broken, not physically, not visibly, but in the space between expectation and reality. And in that quiet, suspended moment, with every eye locked onto the center of the mat, one truth had fully surfaced, undeniable and irreversible. He had never been in control of this situation at all. No one moved. Not even a breath seemed out of place, as the weight of realization settled fully over the room, pressing into every corner of the gym like a quiet truth that could no longer be ignored. Brad stood facing Emily, but the distance between them had changed, not in steps, but in understanding, in the silent recognition that whatever this had started, as it was no longer his stage, no longer his moment to control. The students around them were no longer watching for entertainment, no longer expecting a lesson or a demonstration. They were witnessing something else entirely, something they had not signed up for but could not look away from. Emily remained still, her posture composed, her presence unchanged, as if none of this had altered her at all, and in that stillness, there was something grounding, something that made the contrast even sharper. Brad lowered his hands slightly, not in defeat, but in thought, his mind catching up to what his instincts had already begun to accept. "You could have said something," he muttered, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, almost reflective. Emily tilted her head, just slightly, her eyes calm, not defensive, not proud, simply steady. "You did not ask," she replied. The words were simple, but they landed with a clarity that echoed through the silence, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. A few students shifted uncomfortably, the weight of that exchange settling deeper than anything physical ever could. Brad exhaled slowly, glancing around the room, seeing the faces that once looked to him for certainty now watching him differently, not with disrespect, but with awareness, with the understanding that something important had just unfolded in front of them. He stepped back once, creating space, not to reset the situation, but to acknowledge it. "Class," he said, his voice steady again, but different, grounded in something more real than before. "What you are seeing right now is what experience looks like when it does not need to announce itself." The words were directed at the group, but they carried an admission within them, one that did not need to be stated outright. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer tense. It was attentive, respectful. Emily glanced briefly toward the students, then back at Brad, her expression unchanged, but her presence now fully understood by everyone watching. The earlier whispers had stopped, replaced by something more certain, more grounded. No one needed to question who she was anymore. They could see it. Brad nodded once, a small gesture, but deliberate, acknowledging not just her skill, but the moment itself, the shift that had taken place under his own watch. "Would you mind," he said carefully, choosing his words with intention, showing them that movement again. It was no longer a challenge. It was an invitation. Emily paused for a brief moment, then stepped forward, not to perform, not to impress, but simply to demonstrate. Her movements were the same as before, controlled, precise, efficient, but now the room saw them differently. Not as something surprising, but as something earned, something built over time, through discipline that no one in that room had witnessed until now. The students watched closely, not with judgment, but with focus, trying to understand what they had missed, what they had overlooked. One student leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed in concentration. Another adjusted their stance instinctively, mirroring her posture without even realizing it. The energy had shifted completely. When Emily finished, she stepped back quietly, returning to stillness, her presence once again calm, unassuming, as if the moment had not belonged to her at all. Brad looked at her, then at the class, and for the first time that evening, there was no gap between perception and truth. "That," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the room without effort, "is why you never judge someone by how they walk into a room." No one responded immediately. They did not need to. The lesson had already landed. Emily gave a small nod, then turned toward the edge of the mat, stepping off with the same quiet confidence she had entered with. No applause followed. No noise broke the silence. And yet, the respect in that room was louder than anything that had come before. As she reached the door, one student finally spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard. "Coach, why did she stop competing?" Brad did not answer right away. He watched the door as it closed softly behind her, his expression thoughtful, the question lingering in the air longer than expected. And in that quiet pause, the story felt unfinished, as if what they had just witnessed was only the beginning of something far deeper than any of them had realized. The question did not fade after she left. It lingered, stretching across the room like a thread no one could quite let go of, pulling at curiosity, at respect, at something deeper that had quietly taken root in every person who had just witnessed what could not be undone. Brad remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the closed door, his expression no longer guarded, no longer performative, but reflective, as if the answer to that question was not something he could give lightly. The students waited, not impatiently, but attentively, their earlier energy replaced by something far more grounded. Sometimes, Brad said finally, his voice lower than before, carrying a weight that had not been there at the start of the evening, people step away for reasons that have nothing to do with ability. The words were simple, but they opened something deeper. A few students exchanged glances, their curiosity shifting into thoughtfulness. One raised a hand slightly, then hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate to ask more. Brad noticed, and for once he did not shut it down. She was known, he continued, stepping slowly toward the center of the mat again. Not to reclaim it, but to stand in it differently, not just for winning, but for how she carried herself. Calm, precise, always one step ahead. He paused briefly, as if choosing what to say next with care. But the kind of discipline it takes to reach that level, it demands everything. The room remained quiet, the words settling in, reshaping the way they saw what had just happened. And sometimes, Brad added, his gaze shifting back toward the door for just a second, people decide they want something else out of life. The explanation was not complete, but it was enough. Enough to shift the question from curiosity about her absence to respect for her choice. The class stood still, absorbing it, each person processing the moment in their own way. The earlier version of the gym, the one filled with casual judgment and quiet arrogance, felt distant now, replaced by something more aware, more grounded. One of the younger students stepped forward slightly, looking down at their own stance, adjusting their footing unconsciously, trying to replicate what they had seen, but realizing quickly that it was not something that could be copied so easily. It was not just movement. It was experience. It was time. Brad watched them, noticing the shift, and for the first time that evening, there was no need to correct, no need to instruct immediately. The lesson had already begun to take shape on its own. All right, he said after a moment, his voice steady, but different now, less about authority and more about guidance. Pair up. The words were familiar, routine, but the energy behind them had changed. The students moved, but more carefully, more thoughtfully, their earlier confidence replaced by focus. Conversations that might have been light or joking before were now quiet, purposeful. Every movement carried more intention. Brad walked slowly between them, observing, not with the same critical edge as before, but with a quieter awareness, as if he was seeing his own, spaced differently as well. Near the back, two students paused mid-movement, one of them glancing toward the door again. "Do you think she will come back?" one asked softly. The other shrugged, but there was no dismissal in the gesture, only uncertainty. "I do not know," they replied. And that uncertainty hung in the air, not uncomfortable, but open, like a question waiting for time to answer it. Brad overheard, but he did not interrupt. Instead, he continued walking, his steps measured, his posture no longer projecting dominance, but presence. The kind of presence that did not need to prove anything. The class continued, but it was not the same class that had started earlier. Every correction, every adjustment, every movement carried more weight now, shaped by what they had seen, by what they had misunderstood before. And somewhere beneath it all, a quiet realization had taken hold, one that would not fade easily. That strength does not always announce itself. That skill does not always look impressive at first glance. And that respect, real respect, is not something you give after someone proves themselves. It is something you offer before you even know who they are. As the session moved forward, the rhythm of the gym returned slowly, but it was different now, steadier, more deliberate. And though Emily was no longer in the room, her presence remained, not in noise, not in spectacle, but in the way every person there now carried themselves just a little more carefully. And in that quiet shift, something far more important than a demonstration had taken place, something that would stay with them long after the mats were empty and the lights dim for the night. The class moved forward, but something invisible had shifted so deeply that even the smallest details now carried meaning. And as the final minutes of the session unfolded, the earlier rhythm never fully returned to what it had been before she walked through that door. Brad stood near the center, arms relaxed at his sides, watching closely as pairs of students practiced with a level of focus he had rarely seen from them. Not because they were being told to, but because they had seen something that quietly demanded it. There was less talking now, fewer careless movements, fewer assumptions. Each adjustment was slower, more deliberate, as if everyone had suddenly realized how much they had been missing before. One student paused mid-drill, lowering their hands slightly as they replayed the earlier moment in their mind. The way Emily had moved without effort, without hesitation, without needing to prove anything. It did not even look difficult for her. They said softly, almost to themselves. Their partner nodded, but there was no frustration in the response, only realization. That is because she was not trying to show anything, they replied. She just understood it. Across the room, Brad heard the exchange, and for a moment he said nothing, allowing the thought to settle naturally instead of interrupting it with instruction. That was new for him. Before tonight, he would have stepped in immediately, corrected form, redirected attention, reasserted control. But now, something about that instinct felt unnecessary, even misplaced. Instead, he walked slowly toward another group, observing quietly, his presence no longer dominating the space, but blending into it, guiding without forcing. The gym lights hummed softly overhead, casting long reflections across the polished floor, and in those reflections, Brad caught glimpses of something he had not paid attention to before, the way posture revealed mindset, the way movement exposed intention, the way silence could teach more than words ever could. Near the front, a younger student attempted a sequence, stopping halfway, frustration flickering across their face. They looked toward Brad, expecting correction, expecting instruction. But before he could speak, another student nearby stepped in gently. Slow down, they said, adjusting their own stance to demonstrate. Do not rush it. Did you see how she moved? There was no hurry. The younger student nodded, trying again, this time more controlled, more aware. Brad watched this unfold, and something shifted again, quieter this time, but just as significant. The lesson was no longer coming only from him. It was moving through the room, carried by the people who had witnessed it, reshaped by their understanding. He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, a small release of something he had not realized he was holding on to. Control, perhaps, or the need for it. As the session neared its end, the energy settled into something steady, grounded, no longer driven by performance, but by intention. When Brad finally called time, his voice did not need to rise above noise, because there was none. The students stopped naturally, turning toward him, not out of habit, but out of respect that now felt different, more mutual than before. That is enough for today, he said, his tone calm, measured. He paused briefly, scanning the room, meeting their eyes, one by one, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. Remember what you saw, he added, not as a command, but as a reminder. No one spoke immediately. They did not need to. The understanding was already there. As people began to gather their things, conversation started again, but they were quieter, more thoughtful. The earlier jokes were gone, replaced by questions, by reflections, by a kind of curiosity that did not seek to judge, but to learn. Near the exit, two students lingered, glancing toward the door where Emily had disappeared. Do you think she knew what would happen? One asked quietly. The other considered for a moment before answering. I think she did not care what happened, they said. She just showed up. That answer stayed in the air longer than expected, simple but powerful, echoing the very presence that had changed the room in the first place. Brad remained where he was for a moment longer after most had left, the gym now quieter, the lights softer, the echoes fading. He looked once more toward the door, not with confusion, not with doubt, but with clarity. He had tried to measure someone based on what he saw at a glance, and in doing so, he had revealed more about himself than about her. And in that realization, there was no embarrassment left, only understanding. As he finally turned off the main lights and the room dimmed, one truth lingered in the silence, steady and undeniable. The strongest presence in the room had never been the loudest one, and the lesson that mattered most had come from the person who said the least. The gym was nearly empty now. The echoes of earlier footsteps long faded into a quiet stillness that felt different from any other night, as if the space itself had absorbed what had happened and was still holding on to it. Outside, the cool evening air settled over the parking lot, the distant hum of traffic barely audible, and under the soft glow of a single streetlight, Emily Carter stood beside her car, her hands resting lightly on the roof as she looked out into the distance. Her expression calm, unchanged, as if the moment inside had not followed her. Not at all. The door behind her opened slowly, the faint creak breaking the silence, and Brad stepped outside, pausing for a brief second as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He saw her immediately. Of course he did. There was something about her presence that did not disappear just because she had left the room. He hesitated, just for a moment, as if considering whether to approach, but then he walked forward, his steps measured, no longer carrying the same certainty they had earlier that evening. "Emily," he called out, his voice steady, but quieter than before, stripped of performance, carrying only intention. She turned slightly, acknowledging him with a small nod, her gaze steady as always. "You did not have to leave so quickly," he said as he stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance, something he had not thought about earlier, but now understood instinctively. Emily gave a faint smile, not dismissive, not distant, just calm. "I did not come to stay," she replied. The answer was simple, but held more meaning than it revealed. Brad exhaled softly, glancing down for a brief second before looking back at her. "You could have told me who you were," he said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what now felt obvious in hindsight. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Would have changed how you treated me?" she asked. The question was not sharp, not confrontational, but it landed heavier than anything else that had been said all night. Brad did not answer immediately. He did not need to. The silence between them filled in the truth. He looked away briefly, then nodded once, slowly, accepting it. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "It would have." The honesty in his voice was new, unguarded, and it stayed there in the air between them, real and undeniable. Emily nodded slightly, as if that answer confirmed something she had already known. "That is why I did not say anything," she said. The streetlight flickered faintly above them, casting soft shadows across the pavement, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no tension now, no conflict, just a quiet understanding that had replaced everything else. Brad shifted his weight slightly, his posture more relaxed than before, but also more grounded. "They respect you now," he said, glancing back toward the building. Emily followed his gaze. Briefly, then returned her attention to him. "They should have respected everyone before," she replied. Again, no accusation, just truth. Brad let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. "Yeah," he said, nodding again. "They should have." Another pause settled between them, but this one felt different, lighter, as if something had been resolved without needing to be argued. Brad looked at her again, more directly this time. "Are you coming back?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried something deeper, not just curiosity, but hope, perhaps even a quiet request. Emily considered it for a moment, her eyes drifting briefly toward the gym, then back to him. "Maybe," she said. "Not a promise, not a refusal, just possibility." And somehow that felt enough. Brad nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing further. "If you do," he added, his voice steady, "it will be different." Emily gave a small, knowing smile, one that suggested she already understood that. "It already is," she said. The words settled into the quiet night, simple but final, carrying the weight of everything that had changed in just a few hours. She opened her car door, pausing for a brief second before getting in, her gaze meeting his one last time. There was no need for anything else. No explanation, no conclusion, just understanding. As the car engine started and the headlights cut through the darkness, Brad stepped back slightly, watching as she pulled away, the sound fading into the distance until it was gone completely. He stood there for a moment longer, alone under the dim light, the quiet of the night surrounding him, but it did not feel empty. It felt clear, and as he finally turned back toward the gym, one thought stayed with him, steady and unshaken. Respect is not something you give after you're impressed. It is something you show before you even know who someone truly is. The next morning arrived quietly, but the impact of the night before had already begun to ripple far beyond what anyone inside that gym had expected, and as sunlight stretched across the polished floors through the front windows, it revealed a space that looked the same, yet felt entirely different, as if something unseen had been reset. Brad arrived earlier than usual, unlocking the door with a steady hand, stepping inside with a calm that did not come from routine, but from clarity, and as he walked across the floor, he paused near the center, looking around not as an owner of the space, but as someone who now understood the responsibility it carried. He set his bag down quietly, then moved through the room, adjusting small things that no one had noticed before, straightening equipment, aligning mats, not because it needed to look better, but because it needed to feel right. When the first students began to arrive, they sensed it immediately, not in anything dramatic, but in the subtle shift of atmosphere, the way Brad greeted them. Not with his usual confident nod, but with direct eye contact and a simple, genuine acknowledgement. "Good to see you," he said, and for the first time, it sounded like he meant it fully. The students responded differently too, more present, more aware, as if they were stepping into something that mattered more than just another class. Conversations were quieter, but not forced, just naturally more thoughtful, shaped by what they had experienced. One student set their bag down and glanced around, then leaned toward another. "It feels different today," they whispered. The other nodded slowly. "Yeah," they replied. "It does." As the class began, Brad stood at the front, but he did not rush into instruction. Instead, he took a moment, letting the room settle, letting everyone arrive not just physically, but mentally. "Before we start," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I want you to remember something from yesterday." The room grew still, attention focusing naturally. "Skill is not always loud," he continued, "and strength is not always obvious." He paused briefly, letting the words land, not as a lecture, but as a reflection. Respect should not depend on what you think you see. No one spoke. They did not need to. The message had already been written into their memory. As the session moved forward, the training looked familiar, but the intention behind it had changed. Movements were slower, more precise. Questions were asked with curiosity instead of ego. And when someone made a mistake, there was no laughter, only quiet encouragement. Brad moved through the room, guiding, correcting, but without dominance, his presence now supportive rather than commanding. At one point, he stopped near a pair of students struggling with a sequence. Instead of stepping in immediately, he watched for a moment, giving them space to figure it out. "Take your time," he said finally, his tone calm. "There is no rush." They nodded, adjusting, improving, learning not just the movement, but the mindset behind it. Hours later, as the class came to an end, the room settled into a quiet satisfaction that felt earned, not performed. As students gathered their things, conversations returned, but they carried a new kind of energy, one that reflected growth rather than competition. Near the door, one student paused, looking back toward the center of the room. "Do you think she will come back?" they asked. Another student shrugged lightly. "Maybe," they said, "but even if she does not, she already changed this place." That thought lingered as people began to leave, one by one, the gym slowly emptying once again. Brad remained behind, standing in the same spot as the night before. But this time, there was no uncertainty, no confusion, only a quiet sense of purpose. He looked toward the door, not expecting it to open, not waiting, just acknowledging what had been left behind. Outside, the world continued as it always did, cars passing, people moving, unaware of what had happened inside those walls, unaware that something small had shifted in a way that would last. And inside that quiet gym, where laughter had once been careless and assumptions had once been easy, a new standard had taken root, not announced, not forced, but understood. Because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from being challenged loudly, but from being revealed quietly. And on that day, without asking for attention, without demanding recognition, One simple presence had reminded everyone in that room of something they should have known all along. That respect is not earned in a moment of proof, but shown in every moment before it. And that truth, once seen, does not disappear. It stays, shaping every step that follows, long after the person who revealed it is gone.